pretty long way away. I'm just going to move my chair closer.
Okay. Yeah, we're kind of separated.
Ladies and gentlemen, Debra Granik and Thomasin Harcourt McKenzie. Oh my goodness. I have so many questions I want to ask you about this extraordinary film, this masterful piece of storytelling. Before I begin, we have an hour and I've got heaps of questions here, but I know from having been in the audience a lot myself that sometimes you think of a question when there's a conversation happening, and then when you're asked for questions at the end, it's gone out of your head. So if something occurs to you guys during this time, just stick your hands up. There's people all around with microphones, because I'd like you to be able to contribute all the way through this hour as well. So, and if I don't see you, just go, what was that lovely noise you heard? Actually, let's start with that. How did you come up with that noise?
I can't remember.
Nicole, right?
Yeah, I think it must have been Nicole, the wilderness trainer who we worked with for a week before we did, or was it a week? About a week or so before we started filming, and also throughout. I think her and Ellen must have just, because I don't know, just a signal that they knew and passed it on to us.
And I think Nicole had even maybe heard that when she had worked with the Bushmen in Africa. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good.
And-
Yes.
And
yeah.
that, yeah.
Beautiful. I mean, that leads me on to the extraordinary lack of dialogue, and yet the amazingly complex and deep relationship between the two of you. You know, it occurred to me at the end of the film when you were saying goodbye to each other, you know, a Hollywood film would have filled that scene with dialogue, with unnecessary dialogue, but by the time we get to that farewell between the two of you, my head was running on so many different emotional levels without you having to say a word to each other. Did you cut dialogue as you went? Was there more in the script at the beginning than what ended up in the film? As your relationship grew with Ben Foster, who played your father, did you find, because the two of you were so amazing together, did you find that you actually just needed very little words?
I've got to remember to use a microphone. Yeah, we before we'd film the scene, sometimes in the weekend we'd kind of sit down with each other, Deborah and I, and kind of take some stuff out or add some stuff in. Also just change the lines to make them feel more natural to say, and because we were getting to know Tom as we were filming, and sometimes there'd be a line where we'd go, oh, maybe she actually wouldn't say that, maybe we should say this instead. But yeah, we definitely did cut out some stuff, but leave all the good stuff in.
Well, so much of it was just simply to do with the business of living, wasn't it? You know, right from the word go, you know, Dad, I found, you know, I'm getting great curls on this wood, and can you help me with this? The rain's coming in. You know, I love the fact that most of the dialogue really was simply about that, but the deep connection between the two of you, neither of you really needed to talk about. Did you, well, let's ask, I want to ask about the casting process of these two. How did you put Thomasin and Ben together? How did you find them and find them really as a father and daughter?
Well, I think the connecting with you really started with you, by you submitting such an excellent audition tape from a great distance. Came as a surprise. For a minute there, we couldn't even figure out what was happening in the inbox. You know, we were like, where is this from? Where is this girl located? You know, what's going on? And it was you know, scratching the head of like, you know, and we didn't think about another hemisphere. That hadn't crossed our mind yet. And then you know, I think the story that you and I kind of know, right, is that then we began to speak in conversations through Skype, and you did additional work that was really rich. just some improving that you took upon yourself to do, and that really showed me in so many concrete ways that Tom, that you were very much imagining the screenplay, and you had thought about the book, and that these are things that you would be bringing to the project. So
what was that, Tom? Like when you, as you began to connect with the project, so you read the book and you wrote a diary, did you?
Yeah, so before I left to America and started the rehearsing in America, in Portland, and then the actual filming, I did some research to get to know Tom. I read the book, which is a very different story from Leave No Trace, but about halfway through it goes in a completely different direction. But it's through the mind of Tom, so it really helped me get to kind of become comfortable with her way of thinking and all her thoughts and everything. And and I went to Adrenaline Forest, which is a bit out of Wellington, and climbed some trees. And I did some journaling, and I drew pictures of mushrooms and birds and human anatomy, and I just did some kind of research that I thought might be relevant to the part. I thought about my dad. I just did some research, which is actually one of the best parts, because you learn a lot. You learn a lot yourself, which is good when you're missing like a couple months from school. So, yeah.
And how much time did you get with Ben before you began shooting?
I think the rehearsal period was about 2 weeks, and I think I met him at the beginning of that period on the very first day of wilderness training. And he had gone to the wilderness training like an hour before me, and he built a structure, and I was the first one to try it out. So the first time we met, I had to really trust him that this structure wasn't going to collapse on me, which helped, because it's a relationship that really is built on a lot of trust as well as love and everything. And I think from then on we had about just a couple of weeks to get to know each other, and then we spent just a lot of time with each other in the forest, and yeah.
Debra, this what I love about this film so much is it feels like it's like a slow motion tsunami that just creeps up on you. So, and the fact that it's masterful storytelling, I think, because you give us so much space to let the material resonate, and it was a fascinating experience as an audience member, because there is so much space in the film, and that I felt my head became very, very busy. It resonated on so many levels. There was obviously a deep emotional kick to it, but also it feels like a very political film. Do you consider yourself to be a political filmmaker?
Well, maybe I'll break your question down into two parts, because about the sort of space or silence, that is almost political, right? Because we are in a time in culture making and especially with moving images or filmed entertainment, where the idea would be to plug up every single second with either a thunderous score or with just that there would be very little silence, that silence is considered deadly. And I want to just give such profound props to all audience, all film-going people who can work with quiet film. It's almost extinct, it's a highly endangered species, and there is a risk. There's a risk for all of us, because we are used to a lot of incoming jolts, different kinds of sounds on our devices. We expect incoming. So silence has become even more stark, and in some ways a space in which we could panic, honestly. And so, but then through the process of if someone can ride it out, there is the space to think and wonder, right? There is this space, like the character talks about a little space to think your own thought. And especially if the score's not editorializing, if it's not, bringing in, telling you exactly when you're supposed to feel some kind of clench, exactly when you're supposed to feel anxious on behalf of them, or when you're supposed to feel a little lighthearted. The score, for the most part, Dickens' score there's some places it's classic. When they're being chased in the ferns, it's classic. It's accelerating, it has an adrenaline in it. Other places, it's there, and it's meandering. It's not supposed to be dictating. So politics of silence aside, politics of the country that one lives in, of course, is going to affect you if you're working in social realism. And so the idea that it was very hard for a family that's living undetected, they do not want to be brought in, or he does not want to be brought into the fold. He's chosen to opt out in many ways. This brings up questions. What is he opting out from? Where can he go? Where can they go as a family? What are their options if they don't own property? Very limited. Choosing a lifestyle also becomes extremely limited if you don't own something that allows you to choose this, right? So there were these layers of just questioning.
The moment when the social worker says to him, says to Tom, I think there's no shame in being, what was the phrase? Unhoused, but you can't live there. The government owns that, so there's no shame in, but you can't live there. And I felt all the way through, when we were discussing before the film, the last time I saw it, I just felt this rising rage, which I also found kind of disconcerting because I'm watching an incredibly quiet film and I'm getting hotter and hotter and more furious because of the kind of strange hypocrisies that you just, you don't throw at us, you just show us. And I wanted to ask you about your relationship, I guess, with storytelling and with audience, because as well as it being very spacious from a sound perspective and a dialogue perspective, you really get out of the way of the story too, in terms of the camera. I'm not going, wow, this is an incredibly shot movie, or is this it's disarmingly, seemingly simple, and yet there's so much going on in it. And that requires an enormous amount of trust in an audience, doesn't it?
It does. But it's also, again, sort of the politics of smaller filmmaking. So, and the reason I use the word politics is because the sort of larger industrial practice of making films has oodles of equipment, dolly tracks, and what you talk about, kind of almost an extravagant way of filming, right? Where a camera can swoop down and where it follows tracks and moves very smoothly. And so from that Michael was on his knees, right? Michael McDonough is the DP for this film. He had knee pads on and he kind of came close to your fire pit and he filmed quite quietly. The grip and electric were hiding behind ferns, right?
Yeah, I remember in the final scene of the movie, Bruce, the head grip guy, he was like lying beneath Ben and I, holding this like lighting, I don't know what it was, just like this thing, and he was like lying there like struggling really hard and like trying to keep it up and also trying not to make a sound because it was a really intimate scene. And but yeah, it was really intimately filmed, with McD and the cinematographer not having all that equipment and not having big dollies or massive extravagant shots, but actually being there. It just didn't feel like a camera was there at all. I think it really added to the intimacy and to the kind of raw realness of it. I think the most extravagant piece of electrical equipment, I don't know what to call it, was a drone. One day we had a drone and it was in the forest, and I don't know, it just felt kind of alien almost because everything else was just really just kind of McD in the camera.
Did you find that because of that, the entire crew became really deeply connected to the story?
I would say yes.
Yeah, I think so, and I hope so.
It'd be funny if you said no. We'd have a whole other conversation. And it's like, no, not at all.
Yeah, I mean, by the end of it, it really felt like a family, and the Portland crew and all the workers there are so talented and kind and dedicated and really there.
More like here.
Yeah. So yeah,
They're the best we've got. You know? But I was going to also say that the film was shot in order, which really helps the crew and all of us feel that we understand the story. You know, when a film is shot in order, you're allowed to take a journey. You know, so it was very vivid for people.
and I think every film should be shot in order, because it really does make a difference, not only when you're watching it, but also to the actors as well, because it all kind of makes sense in your mind. And it was really weird watching it for the first time, because I was kind of watching myself grow up, because I was getting my features were getting darker, and I was kind of changing somehow, and it was just really surreal to watch. But I think that's because we shot it in order, and I actually was growing. I think I grew a couple centimeters over it. So, yeah.
But luckily that didn't bring up too many continuity issues, you know. You know.
But also that means when you get to that final scene, that must have been a terrifically difficult scene to play, because of what you and Ben had actually been through and what you and the crew had actually been through in the making of the film, right?
Yeah, and I was in a kind of weird headspace in that scene where I was getting really, hopefully just internally, hopefully I wasn't hopefully I didn't look pissed off or anything in the film, but I was feeling really internally frustrated for some reason. My mind felt all over the place. And also even just doing the rehearsals, we didn't really rehearse it, but we just talked about it. And when we were talking about it, I started tearing up. I was like, oh my God, this is really sad. Yeah.
It's really sad. Debra, there's in both your feature films, I've not seen your documentary film, but there is so much love in those films for these people. You know, you to me, you seem to have a deep love of the kind of lost white working class American, you know, the ones that, if they haven't fallen right off the grid, are teetering on the edge. Can you talk a bit about those people, like what it is about that group, and I know it's an enormous group, of Americans in particular, that makes you love them so much and makes you want to spend so much time with them in your storytelling?
Well, that's a very, very, very big group. So we have to break that down a little bit, because it makes me feel like I can't live up to that kind of, you know, that's so broad. But I think, you know, people, something about 40 hours, right? That sort of the agreement a couple decades was that if you worked 40 hours, that you could live on that. And that, you know, the agreement was that after the Industrial Revolution, that you weren't expected to work more than 40 hours. You were also allowed to have a life, and you were supposed to be able to do something with the money that you worked hard to earn. And so when this really essential agreement was breached, which happened some decades ago now, and then add the gasoline of the financial crisis and having people's homes actually removed. So, you know, internal displacement of huge swaths of people is and there's no set path, there's no cushion as to how people are going to proceed. So I want to be, you know, a storyteller that can look at that and find out how people will make it, how will they get what they need, you know, what is it that they need. And, you know, I'm attracted to any story where I know that that's what I want for someone, you know, or maybe many of us would want that for the person we're looking at, or the, you know, and but there is suspense because it's not obvious how someone's going to survive.
And also, I get a strong sense that there's also a kind of a rejection of the status quo as well, right? I mean, you know, Ben Foster's character doesn't want, I mean, he can't, obviously, but doesn't want to live in that world. He doesn't want a cell phone. He doesn't want to connect with with the urban world. He wants to keep it simple, as you say, you know, as your film does. He wants to keep it quiet, and so as much as people are trying to find a way, it's not the way that apparently they're told they're meant to live, and that's an interesting conflict for people, I imagine.
Well, you know, it's not lost on anyone in the world, right, that the United States is built on some very poignant mythologies, right? And one of the ones that's been kind of a standby and really is bigger, better, more, and the idea of growth, right? And that even your self-esteem might be very linked to what you own, and what, you know, that your material possessions really show that you've made it, and they're supposed to be equated with happiness. And of course, throughout every decade, there's been, you know, not in equal numbers, but some sector of that society that will say, it's never borne out. I don't experience that, and have looked to past generations who do reject that, you know, who say, I would like to downsize, I would like to simplify. Right. You know, none of what is being sort of inculcated in me is actually proving to make sense to me, you know.
It's not working.
Yeah.
Can we talk about war and the vets? You know, there's such an awful paradox which you see in the film of, you know, I mean, I notice whenever I'm flying a domestic flight in America, often at the beginning, you know, one of the air flight attendants will talk about how what a great honour it is to have some war vets on the plane, and how much we, you know, appreciate what they've done for our country, and yada yada yada. And then you look at the reality, say in your film, or when, you know, you wander around an urban area in States, and so many of them are on the streets, which I know we discussed earlier about how this could really be seen as a war film as well, the quietest war film ever made, obviously. But is that something that has interested you? You know, that group of people, of American war vets, you've wanted to tell their story for a long time.
Well, again, that's a large demographic, large cohort. So it's. I think there I was interested in sort of the effect on the child. You know, that there's a really beautiful British documentary called Once We Were Soldiers, and Alan Grisby filmed these young men when they were 21 after Vietnam, and they had just come back to Texas, and it was just one of the really beautiful portraits of the time. And then he filmed them 40 years later. So, and the 40-year later part dealt with the effects on their children, of what it was like to be, you know, to be teen children of combat vets, and it's a legacy, you know, that it affects the generation, but it really comes down into the family, and it can be really an intense thing to be a child that has to understand how to interpret something that someone you care about struggles with on a level that's quite invisible, quite hard to disclose, and so you read some literature from the VA, right? That was geared towards teenage children.
Yeah, I read some pamphlets and read some surveys as well. Those kind of surveys where you rate something from 1 to 5, or do a smiley face or a sad face or something. That kind of survey, and that was the one thing I hadn't researched before I left to America, or before starting the filming process, because Tom didn't know anything about that herself before she actually experienced it, when she was reading all her dad's files. And it's really heartbreaking. It's really horrible.
But as Tom says at the end of the film, what's the line? You know, what troubles you doesn't trouble me. You know, and you would never know. She would never know. Which makes their paths have to separate.
Yeah. Yeah, because I guess you can't, no one can understand those kind of horrors that veterans or soldiers have experienced because they haven't gone through it themselves, and no one wants to experience being on a field and seeing your companions being shot or, going through such hardship.
The scene where they're all, where their houses are being broken up by the crane, is that a common thing? Do you know that, like if because obviously that's a collection of war veterans living together in the woods, and then the crane comes in and sort of rips their, and I loved it because the next shot's of a train with the big flag and Building America on the side of it. Is that a kind of a known thing that they live in the forests in that way, and that the communities are pulled apart in that?
The Pacific Northwest has a huge unhoused population, so
Right.
I mean that's growing in a lot of places, but the Pacific Northwest, because it's temperate, it's not unlike here. It's a pretty desirable place to live, and even though it precipitates a huge amount, a lot of rain, we saw that quite a bit filming, right? The day that we were filming in front of the train station, a whole tent community was raised, and then maybe a day later it builds back, but they're always cleared continually. There are some tent cities in a lot of, quite a few American cities now where there's permission, where they're allowed to stay. And then they've tried some experiments about putting like big tent cities out by airports, like sort of disinvested areas, but then it becomes very hard for people to function, right? To get any place, to get to food sources and whatnot. But yeah, so it's common that on public land, yes, without it being in any way sanctioned, it would be raised, come through maybe weekly, or take them down, and
then they go back up again.
Yeah, so the Rangers had a certain kind of real affection, actually, for people that were who'd lived undetected, because it's like an art form. Each Ranger we met had sort of one legendary character. Like, twice I was shown dwellings, sites where people like Tom and her family had dwelled, maybe single men, but where they had done it well, and they left no trace. They left no garbage. They were meticulous in how they lived, and they were able to live for many, in some cases several years, right? Just like the real life father and daughter that were reported in the Portland paper.
So this story, the original, the book, My Abandonment, that's a true story, right? So this is based on...
Right, it was based on an article that the author had seen in the paper where the father and daughter had been living in this municipal park outside of Portland,
right,
undetected for that many years, and sort of the ingredients in the campsite are very related to the article. The idea that there were encyclopedias, so the article called out a few things about them, and so that part was kept in the novel, and then we tried to stay quite close to that as well in the film.
Yep. Hey, I just want to change the subject radically and talk about bees. How did you do that? How was that? I mean, for a minute there, I was like, oh, that's good. I'm seeing close-ups of your face and close-ups of your hands, but it's actually not you with bees. And then suddenly it was you with bees crawling all over your hands. How did you cope with that?
I loved it.
Did you?
Yeah. Actually, my best friend Stephanie, yesterday she gave me a necklace with a bee on it, and I teared up. I was like, oh, this is really nice. But yeah, I felt really powerful in that moment. And actually, the part where you see the bees on my hand, we weren't allowed to film that on the day because there was insurance and health stuff that was preventing us from doing that. So we ended up filming it like a couple of days after at the actual beekeeper's house. And the beekeeper I worked with, she was in the film. She was the beekeeper in the film. But yeah, it's just incredibly empowering, kind of standing in front of a hive, and you can hear the bees buzzing around and doing their thing, and you can smell the honey and the propolis, and the pollen, and you can feel their warmth, and you can feel the vibrations as well. And it's kind of it's also really inspiring standing there, because they're really bloody hard workers. They've all got their own little jobs, and they're really dedicated to what they're doing and really passionate about what they're doing as well. And so yeah, it was just really amazing. I loved it.
You didn't get stung. That's all I wanted to know.
No,
Yeah.
I wasn't. If I had threatened them, then maybe they would have stung me. But they're not. They don't want to sting you because they die. So.
And another moment in the film I just want to know the story about was those beautiful church dances. The women in the white dresses with the. Did you find? You must have found them. Were they just an accidental find, or did you know what you were looking for there, or?
Well, I was asking myself in the community, for this on behalf of the story, where the community where Tom and her father get located, that farm, since the farm was invested in bringing them to a church, I thought that maybe Tom would make friends. That's not very explicated, but the fact is, you do learn sort of retro that he was the one that brought them. Right. And I asked myself, in a rural church such as this, what would be the entertainment or the spectacle? Because it's been very hard, and I think with how to keep people coming to church, right? It's sort of like, almost like, feels like how to get people to come still to a brick and mortar theater when everyone can stream it at home, and I was curious about this practice of devotional dance as an anthropologist, that part of me that seeks out to know within my own culture things that are not familiar to me, and it turns out, that it's super prevalent. There are 50 states, and in every state of the country, there's a very large number of people that do devotional dance. It's a very contemporary spiritual, it's an expression, and it looks really different in a black church than a white church, and it looks really different in South than the North, the East and the West, and I met Tammy, the lead dancer, and I asked if she was open to, she does this, she goes around to churches with her group. I asked if she would be open to participating in the film and performing the dance. And she had a young friend of hers, create the song, the Christian rock song. And they came up they drove 8 hours in a van, those women that were in the film. They drove 8 hours, they wouldn't accept payment, and they were so scrupulous. They shared rooms, and they came up, they were just frugal, but they did the dance 17 times. The crew was so, right? The crew was so, I think, was incredulous. And they were meticulous. And someone commented, the torque on her flagging, the lead flagger, ravers would be very, my daughter who was like, wow, that woman's really good with those flags,
She's really good with those flags, and you're right.
And they take it seriously, and the music for them is anointed, and it's passionate, and, and I think the crew was very nervous that we'd be laughing at them, and that we'd be, really alienated, and would be very us and them, and I think they really just got under our skin. They were so committed to what they do, and this hobby or this art form for them, that's self-developed, self-derived. We may think, oh, they look odd in their dresses. They make their own costumes, but they, if we laugh at them, it's on us, because they feel really sure that this is something that makes their life feel worthwhile. This is something that does something for them. And they practice very hard, so it's also a very cohesive activity. It also gives them a lot of, they donate those dances to churches, so they feel they're giving something to community. So it's a big cultural divide. Coastal liberals such as myself, I cannot relate to that. That is not an art form that I resonate with. It's not a religious practice that I have.
I didn't know it existed.
Yeah, and yet there was something that did touch me about their commitment. And then when I've seen it in inner city, examples of inner city devotional dance, it looks very, very different, as I said. But again, I have to stop the judgment that says, God, I just don't understand that. I can acknowledge that. That's a fact. I don't understand it. But it seems to be meaningful for a whole lot of people. And I only have one passport. I live on that large continent with a very big country. And I'm going to damn well have to learn to sort of just be at peace with the fact that I can't understand, you know?
But can be with, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I found
that, you know, she overtook me.
Yeah, right.
Her passion and her desire to execute this in her existence, I have to be in a kind of, I want to say, porous and
yes,
friendly relationship to that.
You don't.
You know?
If you feel, I mean, and I found this as an audience member. My initial response was because, oh God, I've never seen this before, and then one wants to judge it, and then you just can't, because it's so it's so honest, you know.
Well,
and
it helps that she speaks, right?
Yeah.
That she speaks to Tom, and also
Yeah.
Tom's receptivity. Tom's, you know, the character
wanting
of
to
Tom,
learn, right? Yeah.
Right. Tom's like in a church, and she's like, "Gosh, haven't seen this before," but she notes everything. That's what I loved about your character. You note. You're so you're observant human being, observant, sentient teen person who goes around noting things, right? But then when Tammy gave you the opportunity to sort of see what the flags were, Tom was willing. Tom was
tell you
willing to
what,
give her the time of day. you
Having
know?
grown up and having to, had to go to church in a little Presbyterian church in the South Island, if that had been going on every week, I wouldn't have protested so much. I mean, it's a great, I can imagine that being a great energy to be around. I've just been given the 20-minute warning, which means that I am going to open up to questions. I just have one more little question to ask you. That I just loved that little moment with Ben and the horse. Why? How did that end up in the film, and how did you create it? Where did that come from?
So Mr. Walter's farm, the farm that they're on, right, is a Christmas tree farm, which is a huge extractive industry of Oregon. 35 million Christmas trees are exported. So it's pretty, it's mega agribusiness, high resource use.
Yes.
But he also had this farm, so the tree farm financed having expensive horses.
Yes.
Having a big barn with horses that he would board, and there was a very beautiful scene with Tom that we didn't make it into the film. Where you're with Chris, right, the horse whisperer, and she's giving a medicinal massage to a horse. Some of them are retired thoroughbreds that have raced hard in their lives, and they in real life, this woman, like the beekeeper, she had a real niche, and her niche was this very benevolent and humane treatment of horses. And Tom, again, as an observant and curious, positive Pandora, you asked Chris a lot of questions. And so this sounds so crass, but you don't even know this yet, but on the DVD, the scenes that we couldn't include, there's the one funny scene of the whole film is on there, the slugs, eating the slugs. The horse scene is on there, and then the actual training when you're in Sue's backyard, learning to handle the bees, the whole training session is on the DVD, and the dance in its complete 5-minute form. With coverage. So you see ECUs, you see the wafting of the flags, you see the real torque of each of those women. Like you see,
vigorous,
you see their
isn't it?
jaw, you see
Yeah.
their intensity. So
Yeah.
we were able to use all the takes in the 5-minute resplendent full version, But back to the issue of the horse. So they each had a scene with the horse. Tom's was this, she questioned some things about intuition, and if horses get lost, do they find their way home? She asked some kind of metaphoric questions.
Yeah.
And with Ben, it was just this silent, I felt like the horse gave him a sign. If you're gonna leave, you're gonna leave now. You gotta leave before dawn. I felt like the horse, and that was it was a pretty serendipitous moment. The horse chose to sort of turn towards him and look at him with that very soulful eye,
God, some horses can really act, can't they?
Yeah. There's been a long history of that,
That's
hasn't
right.
there? Yes,
That's
yeah.
right. It was just an extraordinary moment, and actually one of those beautiful moments that happens in cinema every now and then, where you feel like it felt so private. It was such a privilege to be there, and but also like one was an imposter, you know. A privileged imposter to even be witnessing something like that. It was just so beautiful, so beautiful. Questions? Yes?
How long did it take you to develop the American accent?
I've been working on the American accent for quite a while, just for auditions and everything, because I'd done other American auditions before Leave No Trace. So that was really good, because it meant there wasn't too much stress around the American accent. There was a little bit, but not too much. But I also had an amazing accent coach called Mary Mack in Portland, and she helped a lot. And Debra and I also thought that because Tom hadn't been surrounded so much by other kids her age, and she hadn't picked up their slangs, she would have a kind of unique twang to her accent maybe. So if the New Zealand did come through, then that'd be okay. And there's ADR as well, so if there was a word that sounded very Kiwi, then we could pick that and take it out.
And there were only two.
Hi, I just got a question for Debra. Thank you for the movie, it was a wonderful experience. My question is, how much time was there from when you conceived the idea for the movie and when you started shooting, please?
So the novel was shown to me by two producers that from New York, and they had the option for the novel, and they asked if I was interested, and I read it, and my creative producing partner and I, we were interested, and we said yes, and then we went through a lot of drafts, and that took, I would say that was 2 years, just trying to reimagine the second part of the novel, as Tom pointed out, that we deviated significantly, and there were quite a few interesting options. And you're not privy to all the different drafts that there were, but there were some that were very, very different than what we did, and so that was hard to solve. What was the right landing place for the script? And then I like to do a lot of really just on the ground research, boots on the ground, and that requires going to Portland. I live on the East Coast, so that traversing the country, finding out what are the teens doing, going to some 4-H meetings, asking them to show me some protocols, going to churches, talking to the social service agency, Child Protective Services, what would they have done, what did they do, what would be some of the protocols for sort of triaging them, and tree farms, scouting them, finding out, doing some of that photography of the tree farm actually out of principle. That wasn't going to be possible to do that sort of the helicopter harvesting during the principle. It wasn't that kind of film. And so those trips take time, and then, so all in, I would say from the day we really said we were done and we had locked picture, I'd say it's a 4-year process. And in between that, working on other things. That's because there's some very significant downtime. Like you finished a script and then you're shopping it, and it takes a very long time to hear responses and then to find out whether that financing is real and whether they're going to be, on a page to work with you for real. Then you kind of have to lobby for things like Final Cut, and those negotiations take a minute. So meanwhile, you got to do something just local, where no one's greenlighting you, you're just greenlighting yourself. So that's where the documentary films come into play. So you can kind of keep working in between these chapters of trying to make the narrative.
Can I ask, just connected to that, it seems that at the moment, that there's a lot of, $160 squillion blockbuster action movies coming out of the States, and then there's a huge amount of money being put into television. Where does low budget, relatively low budget films sit now? Is it more difficult now to get funding for films like this than it was, say, 10 years ago? Or
I think it's always been hard because it's a the math on that is an uncomfortable place, right? It's also like another form of, I'm going to say, it's a little repetitive, but it is political. If films cost are budgeted at 160 million, or 100 million, or 80, or 50, or 40, or 20, that's a flagrant statement about the use of money, about a star system, about things needing to cost that much for what, for effects and for an addiction to a kind of, I want to say an opulence or an extravagance or a kind of hedonism, right, that would keep a system going. But it also comes, the Scandinavian dogma movement. I don't know if anyone remembers them in the mid-90s. I still kind of hold a torch for them because they made this comment. They used the word behemoth. They said that the West Coast industrial system is a behemoth. It's a I don't know. We use the term abiyoyo. It's this gargantuan, unwieldy, monstrous mechanism. Monstrous in its bigness and its gangliness and its extravagance and so to work outside of that system is truly challenging because people say, well, where's the revenue stream? Where's the money? Where do you and it's hard won. You can there's right now as we speak, there's this Scrivener in New York at this small distributor that is distributing Leave No Trace. Jack Foley with this amazing, even though he's my countryman, he has an outstanding accent from Boston, working class Boston accent. And he is literally counting every seat. It's a big country, but it's playing in like, at its peak, it's playing at 300 locations. That's very awesome distribution for a small film. But he is counting every seat. Every Friday, he tallies how many, to be crass, how many butts have been in seats,
He's the bookkeeper.
Yeah, he's the bookkeeper. And so every single person that shows up, it's like a vote. It's a vote to keep small films in existence. I've never seen it be so direct. Talk about direct democracy.
Yeah.
That is a democratic practice, to come to a cinema, brick and mortar, and pay your ticket, because he counts and he says, okay, this is, if it can break even, we're good.
But also a film that's not functioning as a kind of a Valium or a tranquilizer, which so many of those big blockbusters do. A film like this, which is uncomfortable at times, and I imagine being an American even more uncomfortable to go and see and have to think,
No, it's hard. It's true. Escapism has always been a really big draw. That filmed entertainment, that's one of the things it can do for us. It's one of the benevolent things it can do for us, right? But not everyone can be on that same beat. I always have to say this. I have to say, okay, there are a huge amount of people that are going to have to pay rent at the end of the month, and they don't have superpowers. There is no spider web that is going to help them. They can't solve it with supernatural powers. It is through their labor. It is through their tenacity. It is through their blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah. And some filmmakers have to be on that beat. Although they're rapidly disappearing from our universe, it is the same analogy as a newspaper. There had to be the human interest beat. There had to be the survivor beat. It wasn't always the entertainment section. The glossy part of it. And so I feel like that's part of some of the function of social realist and small films is to, although it's not always the escapism, it's culling for the nobility, it's culling for the hope.
Yeah.
We're hope scavengers, I think, a lot of independent filmmakers, that we're trying to look for the moments of hope, even if the circumstances are scrappy and they're not always easy.
Yeah.
Not everyone's born on Easy Street,
No.
And 90210 is not the only postal code in the U.S. And most citizens don't have pools, And so therefore, there's a whole lot of stories that need to be told on the margins, actually, Yeah. But they can be lyrical. People can be. What is one of the major weapons of survival, of the salty working class? Humor, right?
Laughter.
Laughter.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Getting by, getting through, getting over, getting
getting beyond. And so, the films don't have to be dreary.
No.
I know that my work has not borne that out so wonderfully sometimes. And, I'm working on the humor.
Dreary is not a word I would use to describe
Well,
your
I'm
film,
glad.
so,
I appreciate that.
There's a lot of, wet leaves in it, but not dreary.
Well, right, or bleak, but the thing is, so it turns out that this is a good example. It is much more acceptable to have a lot of bloodletting, it is much more of a catharsis. I don't know why this would be, but this is someone that, this is a question that we've worked on ever since we left the caves, all of us across the globe, which is, what is so entertaining about seeing another person suffer? It is, we've done it as gladiators, we do it in many different arenas, but now we do it just as really off-the-cuff entertainment, that, people, if someone's wounded, it's acceptable to actually make them suffer more. The way we see on screen has a lot of sadism frequently, and it's considered entertaining, and then there's also, again, always a section of the population that thinks the woundable body of the other, that it's not entertaining to see someone suffer. It's not pleasurable, it's not, but so there's that decision to sort of try to pull out from some of that, if that's the main thrust of a lot of entertainment.
Or if you're going to look at suffering, it has to be through a different lens. Because suffering is part of the human condition, is often at the core of so many stories. But it's not entertainment.
Right, but if I were to try to get money, a lot of money or a little money, and I said, oh yeah, there's a really high death rate in this, there's shooting all the time, a lot of automatic weapons, I think and the women are scantily clad as well while they're shooting, and a lot of drug taking is happening, and there's cartels, and and bad banking and subprime mortgages. The money would just come. That's hot. That's just compelling, rotten stuff. If I say, oh, the film deals with people that are living, they're poor, and they work really hard, I was like, oh God, no. That is just too heavy. People will wilt. I remember that was the four-letter word. It was not
poor. Yeah.
Poor. P-O-O-R was the word that shall not be spoken. I remember with Winter's Bone, it was like, oh no, people will just wither in their seats. People cannot handle seeing poverty. They can. If there was more gunplay in that, we could deal with it.
Yeah, poor people shooting each other's okay.
Yeah, that would be fine. That would be fine.
Yeah.
No one left standing.
Or hot poor people.
So
Really
that
hot poor people.
all of that.
Yes, sorry.
A few more questions.
Yes.
Yes.
Briefly, I just want to say how one thing I loved about it, as well as Tom's character, is that it was actually a portrayal of a man who was different and damaged, but good, a good dad, a good man. It didn't take exactly what you're saying. It didn't take the easy course of, yeah, he is going to shoot someone, or he's not a good dad. And so when I put my hand up just at the beginning of the questions, because I love the scene with the horse and behind the bars. Like, I have a horse who looks similar, and I'm really keen to know what breed that horse is exactly. But to me, that moment wasn't just, you get that connection with horses when their eyes go soft, but the fact that he was like, how did they train you to live behind bars? Because I can't.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very powerful moment.
Yeah.
And what breed is the horse?
That was the real question.
I could find out. We could find out. We could text it to the festival. And once I get back there, we could ask someone who would know.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
One here.
Hi, question for Thomasin. How much, over here in the back,
Right
there. How much physical training was involved with it? Because I noticed, and I found that quite delightful, that in all this rough nature, was still like a very delicate person, and I felt like you didn't really fit right into this rough, uninhabited space. And when I'm thinking about Captain Fantastic or Hannah, normally if kids are in the wilderness, they're always trained to be like assassins or superheroes, and there this was just a normal girl, like hungry and not really, like suffering in the cold, and I was wondering like if there was physical training involved, or if it was just like, you, out in the wild, have fun.
Yeah, we did. So we did I climbed trees and stuff, but we did the wilderness training beforehand. So I got to work with knives, and I got to make fires and go pick plants and kind of figure out what plants you can use medicinally or if you can eat them, and listening to birds and learning how to kind of blend in with nature and not be detected. So yeah, there was a physical side to it, and a lot of that I think was just as a tool so that I could do it. Like I don't know, just so that it was there and it felt real and that I had those skills. But I did get a lot of blisters from the shoot. I've got a scar from the shoot on my finger. There was one scene where my hand slipped and I cut my finger, and it was like kind of blood was like cupping in my palm, and it was going all over the ferns around me. That was. I was looking for it when I watched the film for the first time. I was trying to see the blood. I couldn't though, but so yeah, there was a physical side to it, which was really amazing, and skills that I'll remember for a long time. Yeah.
I've got a question. What was the background of the father? Why was he there? And what happened to your mum? I was very curious. Poor mum, did she die or ran away or
Yeah.
you never knew your mum? Did you ever know?
Well, that was kind of something.
She liked yellow. You liked yellow. There was anything we knew about your mum.
I think that was quite deliberate, that we didn't really find out a lot about the mum. Ben and I and Debra, we didn't really go into much depth about the mum's story or Ben's backstory ourselves, because, I don't know, that's not what the film was about, I guess. And I think a lot of the time there are films with a dad and a daughter where the daughter's struggle is that she doesn't have her mum, so she can't become a woman, or she can't go through puberty or go shopping or something because her mum's not there. A lot of the time that feels like that's the struggle and that's the focus. But so I just really loved that the focus was on the dad and the daughter. The mum was there, and she wasn't there, but she was, she was on their mind, but she wasn't the focus, and she wasn't she didn't have a big part in the story, which I really loved. Because it's just a love story between a dad and a daughter. But yeah, I think the Ben's character's backstory is that he was a veteran and he just doesn't really want to talk about that part of his life. And that's kind of his struggle. Yeah. Thank you.
One here. Hi, Debra. I'd like to ask, what's the most difficult part of interpreting from the novel to the script to directing your actors? Like, is the integrity of the novel important to you?
Well, in this case, so the integrity of the novel is important to me, but it's important to me to make some kind of arrangement with the author that it would be okay to deviate. So in this case, the ending was something that I couldn't really understand. When I spoke to the author, he mentioned to me that some characters were coming into the novel from previous works, that his works were very regional, and they had a lot of connectivity between them. And so when I was baffled by one part of the novel, he said, "Oh, I can understand why. That's something that comes out of my imagination. I've lived with these characters, and it was sort of an infusion of characters from a previous book." And when I couldn't understand them, he said, "Well, why don't you run the story in your own mind, closer to how you imagine it?" And there was a really big fork there, because he imagined that the father had a very grisly death, and that was not something. The more I worked with the screenplay, it was not something that felt as interesting to me to try to work into the story as seeing them part and part by looking each other in the eye, part very with full conscience and full consciousness. So, philosophically and ethically, the integrity matters to me. So, but I would say that in this situation, I had to really be frank with the author. And I think he really enabled me to follow my own intuition. He was someone who could recognize that the next layer from novel to script is going to have it's going to be a different tale. Every time a tale gets told, it's told a little differently. And the same thing when it goes from, the dailies to editing. It's been rewritten one more time in the edit room. So it gets even farther from the original. So I don't know if that's if that was the gist of your question, or.
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you. So the lifestyle shown in the film was thoroughly reminiscent of transcendental philosophy, and especially the work of Thoreau, Walden. And you didn't make specific references to those kinds of cultural influences. I'm wondering whether the decision to leave those kinds of influences almost conspicuously absent, whether those decisions were influenced by your desire to highlight perhaps the personal emotional turmoil rather than any kind of societal or ideological drive that the characters might have had. So more the internal turmoil of personal trauma rather than an ideological pursuit of higher transcendental goals.
Well, I mean, the father in the novel reads Thoreau, and they in the script it was represented. We didn't end up using the dialogue, or we didn't film it even, right? I mean, I think it was very hard to pull off, but there was almost like a sassy comment from you, right? That even Thoreau slept inside, right? Yeah. Yeah, that was a moment of rare sass from Tom, and I think her father appreciated that, she had read, and knew enough about what he was about. So yeah, that for me, it was always in my mind, and it was in Ben's mind as backstory that he did, I love that you reference this. It means a lot to me because we were talking about the positive legacy of every time in the middle of the 19th century, 1850s, there's every decade there have been people in North America who interrogate life and what you need and how little you can live with and how you can live well with little, and instead of bigger, better, more, less, minimal, true, kernel, simplify, exactly, and this philosopher that you're referring to was extremely meaningful to the father, and I think he was bit by bit infusing, one of his homeschooling was, I'm sure he was with great frequency, to the point where maybe her teenage self had to sometimes just say, enough, enough with the Thoreau, at some point. But so yes, at times we toyed. It was funny. It was very hard to, when they had these exchanges where they would quote him. There was a quote about the devil's, the devil polishes the doorknob. I'm botching it, but it was a wonderful quote. Just saying that once you're confined within four walls, a lot can happen that can kind of mess with your free-thinking mind. And but it was stiff. It was hard to get those, because it's Victorian English and almost has a Shakespearean cadence, right? And so it's like, it was hard just to detonate that. And we ended up excising it. But the sentiment is still supposed to be there. And then, in the credits, I tried to make sure that, like, the introduction to Walden is cited, that Bill McKibben did a beautiful, beautiful contemporary introduction to Walden in one of the editions, the naturalist, philosopher, environmentalist. And Ben read Walden, the introduction, we discussed it, so it was in there in ways that just couldn't be overtly spoken. But not because we didn't try. Yeah, he would have, yes.
Okay, on behalf of all of us here, and for those, I guess, who couldn't stay with us, I want to thank you both so much for that beautiful work that you brought to New Zealand for us, and for spending the time with us, giving us more of your time this evening. It's been a beautiful night from start to end. Thank you so much.